Thank you. Thank you. Good morning and welcome. My name is Bill Salmon. I do work at the Hill, and I so appreciate you all coming out here on this ridiculously cold morning in our nation's capital to join us for this really important program. You know, here's a statistic that kind of amazes me. 1 in 4 Americans is a family caregiver. What do I mean by family caregiver? I mean someone who is helping an aging parent or spouse or any other loved one with a disability to live as independently as possible. And that entails a lot, right? I mean, because family caregivers end up managing everything from meals to doctor's visits to bill payments. And by the way, they're doing this while they are also simultaneously juggling their own day jobs, they're raising children or whatever else they've got going on. So as a result, they have not just all of the normal responsibilities of their lives, they now have taken on these added unpaid responsibilities. And by the way, some of the, caregivers end up shelling out about $7,200 per year on average out of their own pocket. And that can be a significant chunk of a caregiver's income. So you end up sort of placing a strain on their financial security, just as they're, like all of us, facing, it's not cheap to buy groceries or electricity or healthcare or a lot of other stuff. So today we're going to really get under the hood and examine some of these fundamental questions about family caregiving, starting with what is the financial toll? And I'm talking about not just on families, on the broader national economy. What about the role of the caregiver? How has that evolved over the last decade or so? And then there are employers. How can employers best support our caregivers? And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about tax incentives and credits and whether those can make a meaningful difference, or whether we have to talk about sort of broader systemic reforms. Luckily, we have lined up some really smart people to answer these questions today. I'm talking about lawmakers from both parties, advocates, experts on family caregiving. They're going to help us understand how best to support the millions of Americans who make independent living possible for loved ones every single day. So we hope you can follow along the conversation on social media and use the hashtag #TheHillHealth. That's hashtag #TheHillHealth. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, AARP, for their very generous support in making today's program possible. You know, I turned 66 last week, so I'm officially an old person. And I got to tell you, the more I learn about AARP, the more I am absolutely convinced it is just an amazing institution. So huge shout out to AARP for their partnership. Now, today is what we call here in D.C. a fly-in day, which means that the members of the House of Representatives are flying in throughout the day so that they can get down to work a little bit later. And as a result, the first couple of interviews are taped, but they're really good. And then we'll have some live interviews for you. So the first interview is going to be with Republican Congresswoman Cammack of Florida, who happens to be the co-sponsor of the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. So she's obviously a key player. She's going to be interviewed by Kathleen Koch, who's a contributing editor at The Hill. So we hope so much that you enjoy the conversations today, whether taped or live. And again, thank you so much for coming out on this very cold but beautiful morning.
Welcome, Congresswoman. Thanks so much for joining me this morning.
Absolutely. Great to be with you.
I think we all have caregiving stories, right? My mom, for instance, cared for my dad for decades before he passed away from Parkinson's. So how has the caregiving issue impacted your family as well as the way that you approach this topic?
Well, it's pretty interesting how so many people find themselves in caregiving positions without really any warning in some cases. I can say predictably being a caregiver as a mom now to a 3.5-month-old has certainly helped shape my perspective. But also, as a millennial, I'm, in the position where we're dealing with aging parents and some of the health challenges that come there with that. And so for my husband and I, we're in the middle of that sandwich generation where we have young children in the home, but also aging parents. And that has really been the introduction that I have had in the caregiving space. And as we've been going through it, starting to, help navigate what resources are out there, I'm starting to find more and more gaps. And you start talking to people, whether it's providers or fellow caregivers, and you're starting to see, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And so that's what's keyed us in on this issue so far.
It's a job that many people take on it's very suddenly and unexpectedly. What do you think that people most misunderstand about the reality of caregiving today?
Oh, I mean, I would say it the fact that there's 1 in 4 Americans today that act in the capacity as a caregiver, and yet it is one of the most under-resourced and really not discussed topics, certainly on Capitol Hill, is a sign that something is really, really amiss. The other thing that I think people think of when they think of caregiving just at large is they think it's, oh, maybe an occasional thing, like, hey, I check in on this person every now and again. No, it can be an all-consuming day and night endeavor. And it depends on really what the situation is, but every situation is unique. And what I have found is I all of a sudden have to become an expert in navigating CMS. Now, thankfully, from my perch on the subcommittee on health, I was able to, jump in and really start to understand some of the things a little bit more readily than maybe some of my counterparts would have. You all of a sudden have to become an expert on navigating our broken system. And I've referred to our system as sick care rather than health care because 9 times out of 10, we're focused on maintenance rather than prevention. And that's very, very frustrating. And then you sometimes have situations and I think a lot of people run into this, where there hasn't been any planning involved. So you're dealing with powers of attorney, fiduciaries, getting set up for being able to be an effective caretaker actually takes a lot of work. It's not just, hey, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to show up one day and sit with this person for a few hours and everything's going to be okay. It is a massive life-changing endeavor. And I think that's why this moment right now that we have with some eyes and on the caregiver space as a whole is a really unique one for us to make some substantial changes to make life a little bit easier for those that need caretaking and those that are the caretakers themselves.
So, speaking of substantial changes, you have introduced the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. So, tell us what that would do and how it would help caregivers.
Well, our bill, the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act, the ABC Act, it simply says that agencies have to go through and streamline resources and eliminate red tape as it relates to caregiving. This is important because anybody who's ever had to deal with a federal agency knows that they would probably rather pull their fingernails off with a pair of pliers than deal with any federal agency because it is horrible. They're not really in the business of customer service, we'll say. And so this would really be an important step in helping caregivers who already have a pile of things on their shoulders already, just taking some of that paperwork burden and streamlining resources. That's a huge help because not only is it an emotional and physical toll for caregivers, but then you are completely emotionally draining. And so this is a good first step, but there's a lot more that we have to do in this space. But I think the bipartisan nature of the ABC Act is a good first step in really reorienting federal resources to a new reality, like I said, that 1 in 4 Americans face every single day.
Now, I noticed that it does seem to have a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. Where does it stand? Are you anywhere close to getting a vote?
Yes, so it's working its way through committee. And of course, we know that we have our Senate counterparts that are moving this along as well. At the end of the year, politically, everything starts to, kind of get jiggled around. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, now we're moving. So we're excited that there's going to be some forward moving progress on it here in the next few weeks.
How else can Congress ease the financial pressure on family caregivers? Are you, for example, a fan of tax credits?
Yeah, I think President Trump has kicked around the idea of offering tax credits to caregivers. I think I saw a number about $7,500 is what is out of pocket for some of the caregivers today. I personally will tell folks that I have seen not only in my personal case, but in many of my friends who are, again, of that sandwich generation, taking care of young kids and then aging parents or grandparents. It's much more than that. And what I've seen is there's really a system of people who maybe have done well in terms of saving. The resources out there are so expensive that it becomes virtually impossible for the person needing services to do it. So you have a double whammy of both the caregiver and the recipients of care. They're just financially getting drained. So tax credits, I think, are something that would help, certainly. And I know President Trump has been very, very supportive of exploring that. And I think you'll find bipartisan consensus for that as well. But I do think that there needs to be a conversation largely about the affordability of services in general. And we see, of course, shortages in different spaces such as nursing and clinicians and other spaces that drive up the cost. We have to do a much better job of looking at this entire environment holistically rather than just trying to pinpoint and put band-aids on little pieces here and there, because it's all tied in so tight together that we have to really do a deep dive into the system as we know it.
I'm wondering in particular about, say, rural areas. Your district, I think, is largely rural, so accessing healthcare and transportation, in particular, for caregivers, that can be even more difficult in an area like that. What solutions do you see for caregivers in rural or medically underserved communities?
Well, right off the bat, obviously, telehealth is a huge, huge option and a blessing in many cases. With that comes some unique challenges. For the longest time, broadband connectivity was a struggle. We're finally seeing some breakthroughs with BEAD money hitting states and the build out for the infrastructure taking place. And in many cases, the rural co-ops have stepped up in significant ways. In my district, I'll speak to Central Florida Co-op, just as an example, in Swanee Valley. They have now started to deliver the final mile, that last mile of connectivity, as part of their services, which for a long time, rural co-ops weren't stepping into the broadband space. But I think everyone collectively realizes today, if you don't have access to high speed, affordable, and reliable internet, you're behind. And that is for healthcare, that is for education, that is for commerce, that is for everyday life. It's not just about streaming Netflix, right? It's about having that access and that connectivity. That's critical. So we're continuing to see the build out of broadband around rural America, which is going to greatly increase our ability to reach people that really need these services the most. And I will again say it's not just going to be for the healthcare for people that are in need of care, but for the caregivers themselves. The mental strain that many people feel, I think, needs to be talked about a lot more. And I do think that telehealth can provide some flexibility, but also access to caregivers who are needing some emotional support. So that's a huge part of it. The telehealth, that is a big part of it. But then again, we talk about transportation. Um, I know of countless families, particularly that are taking care of veterans in their household. Um, the VA for a long time was saying, "Oh, as long as you're within X number of miles, as the crow flies, you can access services at this location." Well, okay, as the crow flies, that might be 20 miles, but that could be an hour and a half in some cases because you're on a two-lane country road going around all sorts of places. And so I think the deployment of continuing to put VA clinics in rural America, for example, is a good answer. But rural transportation is a very, very big issue. And particularly as we're talking about those that may not have, they may have mental or physical issues that are preventing them from being their own, being able to actually drive to go seek care. That's where we have to have a conversation about access to transportation. So I think in the upcoming surface transportation bill, you're going to be seeing a lot of investment into infrastructure that's critical for that. But again, I think that telehealth is going to be the fastest way that we address some of these gaps.
You talk all the time, I'm sure, with businesses in your Florida district. So, what are employers telling you about the growing caregiver pressures on their workforce?
Well, I think there's a big difference between a major, Fortune 500 company being able to prioritize and offer flexibility options like, remote work or teleworking versus a mom and pop operation, which may not have the flexibility in order to say, hey, yeah, you're the front desk person. You can't really be the front desk person from behind a computer screen. And so I think we need to have an option for businesses that meets them where they're at. Government is infamous for one size fits all approach when it comes to business as a whole. But as I said, a Fortune 500 company may have options and flexibilities that your mom and pop operation that employs maybe 5, 10, 15 people doesn't. And so again, I think that tax incentive should be there in ways that really support small businesses that are trying to support their employees, because there's a lot of flexibility that's required when you're a caregiver. And so I think that that's something we need to explore potentially in a Reconciliation 2.0, which has been talked about on Capitol Hill quite a bit. I think that this, again, is the moment where we have an opportunity to really help support small businesses, particularly when they've got employees that need those flexibilities without hindering them in terms of productivity.
Is this in particular a tough issue, really important issue for your state? Because Florida has the second largest population of seniors in the country, more than 7 million, right?
Yeah, it is. It is a huge issue for Florida for a number of reasons. I mean, everyone, when they think of Florida, they think, yes, this is the retirement state, and we've got folks from Naples all the way, and of course, to the villages, which if you've never been to the villages, it is a sight to see. And it is a huge part of Floridian culture, the retirees. But one of the challenges that we have here in Florida is over 1,000 people a day moving to the state, putting pressures on our infrastructure systems. And when you think about housing, for example, I can't tell you how many folks and constituents that I have that have moved here from other states. And, we have a very favorable tax environment here and a lot of policies and politics that people like. So they move here from other states, but what they're doing in the process is sometimes they're leaving behind their support structures. And so I have heard countless times from folks, hey, we just moved to Ocala, but my daughter and her family, they're out in California. They're trying to move here, but it is so expensive. There's just the houses, every time they put in for a house, it's snapped up with a cash only offer, the day that it goes up on the market. The housing shortage issue, the inventory or lack thereof, is a real issue in places like Florida and Texas. So talking about this having a more broad look at caregiving, it's not just, hey, we're going to talk about this one issue or that one issue. It is all encompassing, from our broken healthcare system and the culture around that to really changing the culture of being customer service oriented with the federal agencies to infrastructure for broadband so we can get telehealth and we can make sure that there's rural transportation options for folks. But then again, housing. No one ever talks about housing and the housing shortage and inventory challenges and affordable housing as part of the conversation around caregiving. And it's something that, when you start talking about it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it's never been a part of it in a meaningful, deliberate way. And so we've talked at length about what does that look like for caregivers and relief for caregivers in the state of Florida. We're talking about property tax relief. There's actually a proposal that will be introduced I believe in March of next year, when the session gets underway in Tallahassee, that will eliminate property taxes for seniors. That would be an incredible gift in terms of some financial breathing room for people who are needing assistance. And I just think that there's a lot of things that are happening in this space, but everybody's kind of in different directions. That's honestly what I'm hearing from my constituents, is just the things that no one really is talking about: the housing shortages, the affordability issues. It all kind of ties in and compounds into a tough situation for caregivers and those receiving care alike.
A lot of work to be done on, as you said, a very complex issue.
Yes.
Congresswoman Kat Cammack, co-sponsor of the Alleviating Barriers for Caregivers Act. Thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Have a good one.
You too.